everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to Think Out. This is the monthly debate series of the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So at the Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we address societal challenges through interdisciplinary team research, and we're combining the latest in science and engineering with deep domain knowledge from the social sciences, humanities, business, and arts. In each Think Out, we bring together two leading researchers and industry experts from very different disciplinary backgrounds to discuss and debate an important question the world is facing. In the Think Out, we aim to dive deep into a complex issue, have fun, and engage you, the audience, to this open discussion between leading thinkers. Today, we address the question on how misinformation affects people's attitudes towards vaccination. My name is Vanessa Evers, and together with Hallam Stevens, we will moderate this debate. So over to you, Hallam, to introduce today's experts.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. It's my pleasure to introduce today both of our speakers. First of all, Professor David Lye. Professor Lye is a senior consultant in the Department of Infectious Diseases at the National Center for Infectious Diseases, and he is also the director of the Infectious Disease Research and Training Office. He's the chair of the National Antimicrobial Stewardship Expert Panel at Tan Tock Seng Hospital and an associate professor at Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine at NUS, as well as our medical school, the Lee Kong Chian Medical School at NTU. He has spoken up widely against misinformation being spread about COVID vaccines, including by doctors, and he's been quoted in the media many times about this issue. We look forward to hearing from him more about this. Our second speaker today will be Professor Edson Tandoc. He is an associate professor and director of the PhD and Masters by Research programs at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at NTU. His research focuses on the sociology of message construction and the context of digital journalism, and he's conducted studies on the construction of news and social media messages. He's the director of the Center of Information Integrity in the Internet, otherwise known as InCube, and also, like Professor Lye, has been widely quoted in the media expressing his concerns about Singapore's vaccination program and vaccine hesitancy and misinformation. So what I will do in just a minute, is invite each of the speakers, first Professor Lye and then Professor Tandoc, to give a brief kind of 5-minute kind of introduction. And then we will turn it basically over to question and answer. Vanessa and I will moderate the questions coming from you. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions, also to add comments, to follow up, and so on. And we will relay those to the speakers. Please also add your name and your affiliation. That would be helpful so that we know who you are as well. The way this is going to work is we're also going to start with a poll question, as we always do. Perhaps, Maitri, we could even put that up right now, a kind of audience poll to begin with. And as you'll see, our question for today is: social media is the main cause of vaccine hesitancy. Do you agree or disagree? And at the end of today's session, we're going to ask you this question again and see how many have changed their mind. So perhaps while that is just people are still putting their opinion out there, I will invite Dr. Lye to begin his introduction. Thank you, Professor Lye.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here, but also a bit apprehensive. I'm definitely not an information specialist. So let me share with you how I got into this. So, everyone knows that Singapore has got to a slow start for vaccination initially, and then I kept hearing about all these people send me all these petitions and messages that were going around social media. So I make a few Facebook posts and people shared it as well. Now, on this topic, I think about it in this way. Who are these players? What is it that they're trying to say, and what's the impact that it may be having? So now, firstly, get it out of the way. As some of you may know, that in the early parts of the global vaccination campaign, China did say a few things about mRNA vaccines in defense of its own inactivated vaccines. And the Guardian did highlight that there was also perhaps some Russian influence promoting Sputnik over AstraZeneca, which is by Oxford. But I think by and large, most of the information online is probably not by state players. But who are these people? I think they are a very disparate group. Some people are definitely anti-vaccines, but there are actually other people who are not. So there's this group of critical care doctors fronting this thing called FLCCC, and they're all for ivermectin. But they do get vaccinated themselves. And then there is Dr. Robert Maloney, who did some work on RNA and DNA in the 90s, and he himself got vaccinated. But I think he is trying. One of his own comments is that he may not get a Nobel Prize for it. So I'll leave you to think about that. But I think it's important in this discussion as well to differentiate in vaccine hesitant, which are just people who have some concerns about vaccines, who can engage in discussion, who seek more information, and the anti-vaccine people. And you can differentiate them because when you talk to the anti-vaccine people, you seem to hit a wall, and the same arguments get repeated. You don't get anywhere. That's my own personal observation. So what sort of information? I think I group them into two groups: correct information, intentionally misinterpreted. An example is death after vaccination. So for example, there's about 30,000 deaths a year in Singapore. We're vaccinated 80% of the population now. So there will be deaths after vaccination. But is it coincidental or is it caused by the vaccination? And the way we do it is basically looking at the baseline rate and then seeing if there's excess deaths after the campaign started. And FDA has done that, EMA has done that, HS has done that, and we don't really see that. And the minister has shared that as well. Another example is this thing called the base rate bias. So, when the Bukit Merah incident occurred, the ministry shared about how many people who had been vaccinated had the infections. People would say, okay, 70% of those infected vaccinated, so this must be failure of the vaccines. But this is just, the people that say this actually know statistics and epidemiology, but it is a convenient way of packaging correct information in a misleading way. In fact, you need a denominator. Who were the people who are unvaccinated and vaccinated and exposed at the same time? And the other type of information is incorrect information. Examples being saying that Sinovac works against the variant and mRNA vaccines don't work against the variant, which is the truth is the reverse. And importantly, initially I was debating with some of these people online, and I kind of realized that I'm not getting anywhere. So I put it back onto them. I say, if the people listen to you and don't get vaccinated and then die from COVID, what would you do? And then their real talk is, what if they get vaccinated and die from it? They don't answer the questions. They don't take responsibility. So I basically tell them that the ministry is taking responsibility for the vaccination. There is compensation, and ultimately this is a national. It is international. It's global. And then some of them say it's God's will. So in a way, I think it's important to think about the impact on this misinformation. I think the impact in Singapore is really quite minimal now, because we are small and it's easier to manage. But I think the impact in the region in Southeast Asia, I think, is significant. Indonesia and Philippines started vaccination quite a while ago, and their vaccination is still struggling, and in Malaysia as well. So I think this impact needs to be considered. So that's all I have at this stage, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Lye. I just wanted to note that we have the results for the first poll. 58% agree that, in fact, social media is the main cause of vaccine hesitancy. I believe that was how it was phrased. I'm now going to invite Professor Tandoc to give his introduction. I remind you that you can already start putting your questions and comments, if you like, in the Q&A. So please do so if you have them. Dr. Tandoc.
Thanks so much. First of all, thank you to the Institute for this opportunity to share some of the research that we've been doing at the Wheaton Institute of Communication and Information and our Center for Information Integrity and the Internet. And it's wonderful to be part of this with Professor Lye, whose Facebook post I've also shared myself. So I'm looking forward to more discussions with him. So I think what I wanted to share is how this COVID-19 situation that we're in is making it highlighting the importance of communication and information. We're seeing this in a lot of the phenomena that we're seeing, especially when it comes to vaccine attitudes. First, in focus group discussions that I've been involved in, that we're doing in the US, where we've talked to people who are hesitant about vaccination, we're finding that the primary way of them getting information, learning about the vaccine, is through interpersonal discussion. So they use the media very often, but most of the time when they're figuring out whether they're going to get a vaccine or not, they talk among themselves, with their friends or with their families. So again, the salience of interpersonal communication. Second, in the preliminary results of a series of surveys we've done in 10 cities in Asia. We collected the data in June. We found a significant relationship between belief in fake news about COVID-19 vaccines and being not willing to get vaccinated. So there's a positive relationship between fake news belief and hesitancy or unwillingness to get vaccinated. And this is one area that we've been looking at, the area of fake news. And like what Prof. Lye mentioned, there are various motivations for those who are producing fake news, whether related to COVID or not. One is financial. Those who produce fake news do it to get all these digital advertising into their websites and make money based on that. But it's also sometimes, or most of the time, motivated ideologically. There are some actors who are pushing a certain propaganda. Some actors are engaged in disinformation warfare, where it's now more cost efficient to negatively impact a target society or community by using disinformation and misinformation rather than physical warfare. Third, in studies that we've been doing on vaccine hesitancy, and in general, theoretical models predicting health beliefs among people, an important factor is what they call cues to action. So when people try to decide about, try to make health decisions, they also look at cues from certain actors. In a study that we did in Singapore, when it comes to cues to action, people pay a lot of attention on health experts and also government sources. And in that survey that we did across 10 cities, also true in the data from Singapore, we found that willingness to get vaccinated is predicted by folk believing in or trusting government sources and health experts when it comes to cues to action about getting vaccinated. Fourth, one way that people try to combat misinformation about COVID-19 vaccine is through fact-checking, which is, again, fact-checking is a type of message, it's a form of information, and again, trying to just demonstrate the importance of communication and information at this period. Fact-checking has been used to debunk different inaccurate claims, including those about COVID-19 vaccines. And in our center, we've been doing research on whether fact checks are effective. They don't reach the target audience most of the time. The overlap between the fake news audience and the fact-checking audience tend to be very small. And when fact checks actually do reach the target audience, they're not always 100% effective. So we're also looking at what message strategies can make fact checks more effective. We're looking at modality. Does a text-only fact check versus a text plus visual fact check, which one is more effective? We're also looking at length. In a period when there's so much information about COVID-19, a lot of people are experiencing what we would call COVID-19 information overload. Maybe a longer fact check might give them more information than what they need, and that might negatively interact with feelings of information overload. So these are some of the things that we're looking at when it comes to fact checking. And finally, we're also looking at trying to profile these people. Who are those that are not willing? Who are those who are hesitant? And I think it's an important distinction that the vaccine hesitant are not uninformed. Studies have found, even in other contexts outside COVID-19, those who are hesitant about different types of vaccination actually try to get information about vaccines. And so they have some information, and because of conflicting information, to some extent, that's what makes them unsure. The unwilling, though, are difficult to convince whether there is actually evidence that is presented to them. So we're also trying to understand who are these people. So if we compare the hesitant and the unwilling to the willing, and again, a survey we did in Singapore and focusing only on the unvaccinated, we find that those who are willing to get the vaccine tend to be tend to have higher educational attainment. They tend to come from higher income households. Those who are not willing or hesitant tend to be less trusting of institutions. Of the three groups, the hesitant, the unwilling, and the willing to get vaccinated, the unwilling tend to be the least trusting of the government, of the media, and even of medical experts. They also, the unwilling also tend to have the least amount of news consumption among these three groups. So this is an ongoing study, and I would also love to hear what those who are joining us, what you think, and I look forward to discussing more.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Prof. Lye, Prof. Tandoc, for these introductions. Really fascinating. It's really wonderful, especially to hear from the different backgrounds that you come. Prof. Lye, your kind of, I want to say, struggles in trying to convince people, and to see some of your colleagues maybe not using the appropriate strategies, even though they might mean really well. People make mistakes, of course, but now the mistakes can have so much consequences because doctors have become these famous people, famous kind of celebrities that people want to listen to. So everything they say is weighed on a golden platter, and that's maybe not something that you're trained for. Of course, as a vaccine expert, as a scientist, you're trained to engage with the public. You're trained to do science communication. It's very important, but this is kind of different. It's kind of acting like a judge on different types of information. How have you found this role? Do you have any advice for people out there juggling with these different responsibilities?
So, I mean, I think it is really a difficult thing. And through this, I realized that we have not communicated science to the public very well. I think it's definitely something that we need to do better. And by and large, public communication in science and medicine is still fairly conservative. I mean, sure, all ministries are on Facebook, some of them are on Twitter, but effective communication on social media is a specialty. I mean, there are many people who want to be Instagrammers, but there are very few real influencers. So, but when it comes to public policy, the concern is always the impact. You may have a very popular post, but if it misleads people, then the impact is of concern. And I think that explains why, in general, public service tends to be a bit more conservative. And it's not a role that I want to be part of. But I'm also very clear what I wanted to do. I was merely trying to counter the influence of the doctors. We always know anti-vaccine groups will rise to the occasion, That's why vaccine exam surveys were conducted last year, towards the end of last year. But we think it's a small group in Singapore. But when doctors and some scientists started to speak up against something, then they need to present information in an objective manner, in a balanced manner. And basically, I kind of did that because I felt that they weren't presenting information in a balanced manner. They were giving one-sided information, and they are trusted. And so as Edson mentioned in the survey, and these are people that the public trusts. Yeah.
Thanks.
Perhaps there's a question in the chat that kind of follows up on that. So perhaps we can just I can just mention it here from Professor Ang Peng Hua at Weekend We School. He is asking specifically about these doctors that you kind of counted online, and asking what category of anti-vaxxers would you place them in, and yeah, I think also why are they doing it? Perhaps that's the kind of really interesting. What do you think is motivating them to do what they did?
It is really hard to classify them because they're really quite a disparate group. I don't think they are anti-vaccine in that sense, because if you look at their messages, they are promoting initially Sinovac over mRNA vaccines, and why would they do that is a question that I've never figured out, and I'll come to that shortly. And they were also promoting ivermectin. They believe in ivermectin. Some of them actually use it themselves, and then they seem to be anti-government, because after that they started petitioning criticism against the expert committee, against the multi-ministry task force, which kind of confuses me. They don't seem to have a theme that they are driving. It keeps moving from topics to topics. So why would someone take? So Sinovac has published finally its own data to show that within 6 months after 2 doses, the antibody disappeared to nothing. But we always suspected that would be the case because they produce very basic level of antibody. So they need a 3rd dose to get it to the same level as AstraZeneca and Sinopharm, for example, which I consider moderately effective, active vaccines. So Sinovac really is a 3-dose vaccine based on Sinovac's own data. But these doctors were promoting Sinovac way before this data came out. And I have no idea why, to be honest. And it crossed my mind when I talk about state players, and you can never find out. So can we do anything to persuade them? After their first post, Ministry of Health did engage them, and they were invited to the doctors chat group, but I don't think there was any impact. It was basically persevering with their passion in the area, which keeps moving. Yeah.
That's very complicated. Edson, do you want to comment on what kind of phenomenon might be happening there?
It's really difficult to uncover intention unless you really talk to them, and even if you talk to people, and that's something where we're also grappling with. Even if you see a piece of misinformation, you really can't tell what's the information, the intention, and the motivation behind it unless you talk to them. And even if you talk to them, they might not be very clear, right, with the motivation. So I also am not sure, but I think what's important to realize is what we're seeing is that believing in I would say unverified information is not only a phenomenon among those who are less educated. We're seeing this in even highly educated people, and I think it's really the motivation. It's not the intellectual. It's not only the cognitive ability that's driving this misbelief, but also motivations, and that's something that's difficult to uncover.
Yeah, so I think that also relates to another question here from Shi-Wei Chen, which is maybe a more general form of that, right? Like, how do we I was just wondering if you can say anything more about how do we explain this phenomena? I think we all kind of when you said earlier that, you know, kind of educational attainment or kind of lower levels of educational attainment is associated with vaccine hesitancy, I think that kind of is, you know, that makes sense to a lot of us intuitively, rightly or wrongly. But you know, how do you explain this other phenomenon then, that there are some doctors, health professionals, scientists out there who are also seem to be you know, engaging in all kinds of anti-vax or vaccine hesitancy kind of rhetoric?
So in literature on misinformation and disinformation, an important factor that is being looked at is cognitive biases. You know, so humans are cognitive misers, so we have limited cognitive capacity, and so it's always easier to process something, an information that is already consistent with our prior beliefs. And so what I'm hypothesizing is, you know, some of these experts might have already prior beliefs about vaccination, or maybe about certain types of manufacturers of vaccines. And when they encounter certain information, they screen it through the lens of their prior beliefs. And it's just easier to gravitate toward something consistent with what you already believed in. And in some studies, survey studies we've done, we try to compare that with, say, cognitive ability, whether in some instances, at least for some individuals, your cognitive biases might overpower or override your cognitive ability. So even if you have a high level of cognitive ability, your cognitive biases might still overpower that.
Yeah, I see another message coming in from Zach Lee, which kind of could build upon this, and that's this idea of kind of the new versus the old vaccine. Prof. Lye, you mentioned that Singapore, even you were part of the committee that selected the vaccines that were to be endorsed by the government, and even though the mRNA vaccines were kind of new, they were still chosen. That's kind of like the new versus the old. Could you collaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I think two of my colleagues have already shared this earlier this year, Professor Bansit and Dr. Lisa Hui. So we have a group of experts that engage all the companies very early last year. So it gave me an insight into, you know, how proactive is our government. You know, the Malaysian minister mentioned something about we pay more, therefore we got it earlier. I don't think that's true. We engaged them very early. We try to understand the science. So now we are totally conscious that protein subunit and whole virus inactive vaccines are traditional and safer, and viral vectors and mRNA vaccines are newer technology. But we also have to look at the science. So one of the things in this whole development is, will the vaccine cause more what we call vaccine-related severe illness? And the way to risk verify is look at the T-cell response. So it's immunology. I can tell you that almost all the companies have this data except for Sinovac. We just can't get the data out of Sinovac. And the other thing we look at is the antibody response. In the absence of phase 3 data, which is subsequently what came out, that's what we go on. And do we pick a vaccine that produces just a bit of antibody like Sinovac, or do we go for best of breed, which gives you very high antibody, which essentially at that point is Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech. And so these are some of the science-based selection. And of course, when we look at the trials later, it is also very clear. We have large 30,000 trials, which never happened before. And then you have Sinovac with, 12,000 in Brazil. And it's clear to us which are the ones which are important, which are well done and solid. And so conventional or traditional doesn't mean that they are the best. We have to look at data objectively. And subsequently, as the rollout happens, we have so much post implementation data on on AstraZeneca, on Moderna, Pfizer, and we just can't get the sort of data, comparable data for Sinovac and Sinopharm. The countries that use them don't have this data publicly. We don't know if they collect it. The companies don't have it. So it is very difficult for one to judge. And if you look at vaccine safety, that is highly important, because when Chile finally published its phase 3 trial, its real-world data in New England Journal of Medicine, actually the anaphylaxis rate for Sinovac is actually higher than mRNA vaccines. And yet, before that, everyone says we have anaphylaxis, severe allergy from Moderna and Pfizer, and Sinovac is the one you should go for, which is, in retrospect, false. Yeah. I hope that answers the question of, we are aware of what is all, but the data is just not there to support it.
Yeah, and it's also clear is that there is this information. I mean, you're explaining it really clearly, what the reasons were for choosing and why there is no data supporting conclusions around the other vaccines. But even then, even though that information seems to be available, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A that are exactly around that. Why is the Singapore government kind of turning around when it comes to Sinovac and considering it as okay? What some people had vaccine and they died. What about that? So it's so interesting. The topic that we're talking about is happening as we're speaking. People are trying to interpret the information, even as you are giving it very convincingly. But still, it's so hard to interpret. It's still hard to draw the conclusions from it. It's almost like people want the set conclusions from someone that they trust. But then, as they try to tell that to someone else, because they trust it, it breaks down because they can't explain why they trust that information. It's like, I don't know, Brad Pitt tells me that you need to take a vaccine. I'm like, all right, I trust Brad Pitt, I'll take that vaccine. But then I want to explain to my mother, it's not enough to say to her, well, Brad Pitt told me. And so there seems to be this complication of convincing one person is not quite enough because they can't bring it across. Could you comment on that, David? Is that something that you're seeing, Edson, in your research?
It is, the amount of information, and to answer that, I also touched on what Richard Sugru has asked as well. Where do you get information, right? So there's a lot of websites, and I basically tell people it is confusing, but if a website is not authoritative, ignore it, because everyone can have an opinion, and what we should be seeking is good opinion. It's balanced opinion. And to the member of the public, you won't be able to do it, right? And even to a lot of doctors who are not trained in research or evidence-based medicine, they will have difficulty dealing with that as well. So why would WHO, of course you can say one of these international organizations may be biased, may have an agenda, but why would all of them say the same thing? WHO, US CDC, Public Health England, Ministry of Health Singapore. Why would they all say, is there really such a global conspiracy? So these are just logical thinking. It does not need science. And but unfortunately, there is generally, the minority of these people do have distrust, and it doesn't help that big pharma has a bad reputation in the past, and maybe even currently. But the other issue is also scientific literature. To a lot of people, even to some scientists and doctors, distinguishing between predatory journals and reputable journals is difficult. And it doesn't help that New England and Lancet have published, fake studies even as recently as last year from that data surgical care database. And Richard mentioned about Andrew Wakefield, for example. And now, of course, a lot of these bad, poorly conducted studies or meta-analysis couldn't get into the good journals, but there's plenty of journals that you can just submit and you get accepted within a day, as long as you already pay money. And then people start sharing it around. And it only took a graduate student, for example, a few hours to pick up all the faults in the largest study in ivermectin. So essentially, when I talk to my friends and family, I basically tell them, go for the official trusted sources of information, which could be your Ministry of Health in your country, which could be professional organizations, or global organizations like WHO. I think this is the simple way of countering misinformation.
Sure, but David, I think the questions in the chat, I mean in the Q&A, say, all right, we do that. Yeah, the information tells us that Sinovac is not as effective, but on the other hand, the government is considering Sinovac as okay, and I guess it's that dichotomy they just people can't wrap their heads around, because they trust the government, they trust. Sorry, Helen.
Right, and then there's a question also here from Andressa Michelotti that says that in Brazil they've had the problem that you can't trust the government, right? In fact, or is that if you trust the government, it's going to lead you not to trust vaccination, right? So this is you can't. The problem is perhaps who is the authoritative source here, right? So yeah.
So in the case of Brazil, I guess they can trust PAHO, right? So let me address this thing. I have sought clarification on the announcement last week about recognizing all vaccines that's approved under WHO EUL. So essentially, what was to be avoided was that we want most of our population vaccinated with a highly effective vaccine. And as it turns out, T-cell response is actually better in mRNA vaccines. And now that we are, one dose fully vaccinated more than 70%, no, 2 doses fully vaccinated more than 70%, and 1 dose more than 80%, the government is going to accept, and it's mainly because of returning residents. It is, if we don't recognize them, it means that we'll have to give them another 2 doses of mRNA vaccines, which doesn't make sense scientifically. Okay, and it also the data for protection of severe disease actually is there for all the vaccines. Okay, so at the start of this, in the middle of last year, we are all hoping for a vaccine that will be sterilizing, and so which means that a person vaccinated will not transmit the virus to the next person, which will also means that we have herd immunity and the pandemic will end. It is very clear now that not a single vaccine currently in use can achieve that. And in general, transmission can be reduced by 50% or so by many of the vaccines. So the good data came from Pfizer, BioNTech, and AstraZeneca. So you can reduce transmission by 50% you're vaccinated, but you will still transmit half the time. But protection against severe disease range from about 80% to 100% across all the vaccines type. So now that most people have been vaccinated in Singapore, we can't exclude the others. It doesn't mean that we want to encourage their use. We definitely don't want to encourage their use, but it is also this. I mean, it's true no fault of their own. I mean, we have people living in different countries, and if the question is ever asked, what's the best vaccine? Is the vaccine you can get at a time. This is something that many of us say, and people have been vaccinated with AstraZeneca, with Janssen, with Sinopharm, Sinovac, and we know that they'll be more likely to get infected, and they may get more severe disease compared to Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna. But now that the whole population is well protected, we can accept some of them.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that explanation is so logical, and it immediately makes you feel, oh, I get it. Of course they can't jab returning people again with a totally different vaccine. That would be weird. But it seems that that more complicated, logical story gets lost because there are sound bites. One soundbite is Sinovac is inferior. The other soundbite is Sinovac people won't need to get an extra, will be seen as vaccinated. And the public is thinking, wait a minute, those two don't go together. And the way you've just explained it, David, I mean, it's so logical and clear, but obviously people are struggling to interpret that message. Edson, is that something that you found in your research?
I think, yeah, I mean, just continuing the conversation, I think it's also important to look at the role of the news media in amplifying these information. I think it's a difficult expectation to have to expect the lay public to directly access and digest scientific information from these journals. So a lot of the information that will be accessible to them, understandable to them, would come from the mediators, such as the news media, or in some cases their own friends. And I'm glad that Dr. Lye is also actively engaging in communicating scientific information directly to the public, which I think not enough scientists and health experts are doing. And maybe that's also part of why scientific information is still quite difficult to access for the lay public. But I want to focus also on the role of the news media, because these confusion might also stem from, I mean, when we talk about this seemingly conflicting information that come from news sources, those who do make the news, like from government sources. A lot of these confusion might be amplified by news coverage. And news coverage, I'm a former journalist, so it hurts me to criticize journalism as well. But you know, journalism and news coverage has a tendency to focus a lot on negative aspects, because that's what people like, or that's what people are drawn to. There's also a focus on isolated incidents, like how do you start a news story? You focus on one specific case. So someone fainted while getting vaccinated, or there's like 5 cases of deaths that may be linked to the vaccine, even if it's unconfirmed in a certain country. And I think it's important to know that in Singapore, we have access not only to the national media, but because it's a very small media market, we are increasingly also exposed to news coming from other countries. And so these tendencies of the news media to focus on negative aspects of information, and also to amplify isolated incidents, and then inadvertently create seemingly a pattern, a negative pattern in countries, I think it's also playing an important role in amplifying these amplifying these confusion.
Thanks, Edson. Yeah, I think that's the media here in all its forms is a super important part of this. I want to go in perhaps a slightly different direction here. There's 2 questions that are perhaps related to one another. One from Kim Fat-Chong and another one from Andy Prowl, one of your colleagues, Edson. And these are both about the kind of broader question here of distrust in science, and how much you think that vaccine hesitancy is a symptom of a broader distrust in science. And Fat-Chong asks whether it's related to anti-GMO, climate change deniers, anti-evolution, anti-science in general, and whether there's some commonalities here, and whether that's something you've seen. And if so, what do we make of that, and what can we do about it?
Let me respond to that first. I mean, we have a hypothesis that we're testing. We're seeing that those who are unwilling to get the COVID-19 vaccine, some of them are also have refused vaccines before. So definitely there is anti-vaccination sentiment cuts across different types of vaccine. We're not sure about those who are hesitant. This one is a hypothesis. We've not specifically tested it, but for the unwilling, it seems that it's a general attitude toward vaccination. What is causing this, at least among those who are the anti-vaxxers, I think part of that, established by earlier studies, is really a lack of trust. Others have looked at conspiratorial thinking, that these people just for some reason tend to believe in conspiracies, in a wide range of conspiracies, more than the average person. So there definitely is something contextually that can explain this, but I think also maybe as there's also like social psychological factors related to this. But I would stop there because it's this hypothesis that we're testing, and we've not done empirical analyses yet. I think there is something there. Anecdotally, my friends, people I know, my social network, those who believe in those who are against vaccination also tend to support certain politicians, world leaders, and so I think there is something there. But again, I don't have the data to support that hypothesis, test that hypothesis yet.
Perhaps, yeah, I mean, I guess perhaps the next question here is really about how to then, I mean, this I think is something we've touched on a little bit already. I mean, this question of trust in institutions, and I mean, this perhaps goes back to something that Professor Lye mentioned a minute ago, and the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry. And, you know, I mean, we've talked a little bit about trust in government, but I wonder about kind of trust in what role trust in corporations plays here too, right? I mean, and in this case, we're specifically talking about the pharmaceutical industry, and I guess I'm interested in, you know, what role that is playing, and again, what do you think? Also, what do you think we can do about it? I think, yeah, I kind of want to move towards these questions of what can we do about it, which I think some of these questions in the chat are kind of leaning towards now.
And it's a difficult question, trust in industry, because the industry ultimately answers to its investors and is profit driven. And there are a lot of examples of issues with industry, with the pharmaceutical industry. An example is the 2009 pandemic, with data on oseltamivir, publication bias, and so on. And but I mean, Pfizer-BioNTech is actually BioNTech that developed the vaccine. Pfizer is just an industry partner that make it work. For the Moderna vaccine, you know, NIH is actually the main academic partner. So in some way, you know, they weren't big pharma. They were small biotechs. They are big now, and so. But importantly as well, we need the vaccines. We needed the vaccines, and in the middle of last year, no one is certain. If you go back and look at the discussion and predictions, then we'll be happy with one vaccine that partially works. That's why 50% was set as a mark. You know, we discussed at WHO forum, you know, is that enough? But people are so pessimistic that they accept 50%. As it turns out, we have a lot of vaccines that can get above 80%. And so I think it's difficult. And but you can't also over-regulate the industry, because without enterprise and innovation, there'll be no drugs, no vaccines, no treatment for patients. So we do need the industry. The industry has come up with its own code of conduct, but at times they don't follow it. You know, I don't have the answer for that, except that I work with them, knowing that what I'm into. I often tell them upfront my concern about them. So, but of course, the people that I deal with are the regional people, not the international headquarters. But I'm very upfront with them. I said there are concerns about working with industry, and as a doctor, as well as an academic. But if we agree on collaboration in this sphere, then we can go ahead.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry, Alan.
No, go ahead, Vanessa.
I just wanted to, because we're reaching the end of our session already. I mean, we could go on forever. It's so fascinating. I just wanted to pull together some of the questions that are still there by May Olwin, Zach Lee, and Richard Segru. They're kind of around the literature, research literature, and communicating the findings. May focus a little bit more on, you know, what is the educational, how do we deal with that educationally? But I think the questions all revolve around, you know, there is so much literature out there when it comes to COVID at the moment, and it keeps coming in. It's like a tsunami of literature, and some of it is good, some of it is not so good. Some of it we just needed it, even though they only had 6 participants, but we needed it badly. And it's too much for a human to go through and assess. It's too much for us to have an ongoing literature review that is constantly updated. And that's our first problem. Then the second problem is, okay, if we can do that, then we still have the burden of communicating that to the public. So we're kind of caught in this catch-22 of trying to catch up with the latest information. Do you have any last comments on that? Any advice to all of us, your colleagues, either in the medical field or in the information field or in the computer science like myself, trying to develop tools to be able to go through that literature in a much quicker way?
I think in universities, whether you're in science or whether you are in sociology, I think people do learn about how to evaluate literature. It is part of this education. Now, of course, user education is not universal, and therefore, how do you communicate science to the public? I think this is an emerging area. Definitely, for the National Center of ID, I have discussed with my colleagues. We are going to work on this, and also using social media. I think if you don't deal with social media in this age, you are going to fall behind in your objectives. And our target is not other scientists, that is through the usual academic avenues. I think communicating science to the public is an area that is highly important from this pandemic for the last 2 years. And I think all fields of academic pursuits should consider that. And I mean, when it comes to Richard's comment, I think journals really have to look at the way they function. If you look at the Lancet series, for example, it always likes to be first, it always likes to be controversial. And in some of the top science journals also likes to be novel, even though some journals said now, confirmatory studies will be accepted, but ultimately they want to be novel. That is how the top journals get ahead. And but the main thing about the journal is actually the rise of the predatory journals, and that is the main threat, I think, to academic to science and medicine, because if your science is good, you will get published somewhere. Unfortunately, with the rise of predatory journals, even fake science can be published, but how do you shut it down? You can't, because it's a free world. And therefore, I think having a directory of predatory journals, which is currently available, and publicizing that is important. That's all I have on this topic.
Thanks, Professor Lye. Perhaps at this point, I can invite Edson to give some last comments on this as well, and also perhaps, Maitri, if we could put up the closing poll as well and see if people's opinions on this have changed. But Edson, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Dr. Lye has said, I think that the question really, we're seeing some issues with first, the dissemination of scientific information on one hand, but also the reception of scientific information on the other hand. And so I mean, in the research that we were doing in another context, looking at how scientists, experts, and the public deal with energy-related information, we see some mismatch between how experts communicate their science versus how the public access or learn about technologies, information related to energy. I think we're seeing that in a lot of different areas of science. So what would be a long-term solution? I agree with what Prof. Ever said, that education training, I think, is a key. It's a long-term intervention, but I think it's worthy to invest in it. But how do we do that properly and more effectively? I think we should focus more on teaching and training people about processes rather than just information. So like I think a key limitation of fact checking is it tries to fight fake news by providing correct information. But those who believe in fake news and misinformation don't think they are wrong. They don't think that they're uneducated, right? And so I think providing them with more information might be less helpful. But if we train them about processes, how do we evaluate a piece of information? I think that will be more worthwhile. And when we talked about education and training, it's also two ways. We need to train future scientists how to more effectively communicate their findings and their results. When I did my PhD, for example, I'm trained about research methods and all these theories, but we don't really get a lot of training about how do you communicate your results beyond academia, beyond the academic community. So maybe that's something that we can look at. But at the same time, I think we also need to start training our students about news media and social media literacy. Looking at how news is constructed, how social media messages might not be accurate all the time, and what are the tools and ways that we can use to ensure that we are able to sort out what is real and what is fake in an information overloaded environment.
Thanks a lot, Edson. So we can see, Hallam, that actually the answers have flipped at the end of the poll. First, people felt with 58% that social media is the cause of vaccine hesitancy, and 43 disagreed, and now it's actually the other way around. So I'm not sure what conclusion we can draw from that. I guess the more complexity around why people are vaccine hesitant has come to the front. So yeah, I'll close off the series now since we're reaching the end. Thank you all so much. This brings us to the end of the Think Out debate. And our thanks go to Professor David Lye, who specializes in infectious diseases, and Professor Edson Tandoc, who is an expert in journalism with an interest in studying how misinformation changes public opinion. Thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to the audience for your participation and your wonderful question. We weren't able to get to all of your questions, but the discussion was really great. So we hope that you can follow us on the internet, Facebook, Twitter, all that wonderful social media that will bring you the truth. And to learn more about this debate series, learn more about the research of our two experts today, which we will advertise for you, and to learn more about the speakers and their research. Please join us for next month's debate. It's about architecture in the post-pandemic world. Thank you so much all, and hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.